It doesn't seem possible to engage in something as grand as the conquer of space without paying for it. The cost is certainly great in terms of money and resources, but it is incalculable in terms of human lives. The American space program had its own major setbacks like Apollo 1, Challenger, or Columbia. The Soviets had their share of dark days as well, and being able to power through them is testament to their tenacity and strong will. Often, the spanner thrown in the Soviet works was itself a Soviet spanner. The Gulag, for example, which was an organized system of forced labor created by the Soviet Union, has made millions and millions of victims of its own people. Even the main hero of our story, Sergei Korolev, had been a victim of the Gulag, as you've heard in episode 1. But the bleeding edge of technology is called that for a reason. In the history of the Soviet space program, people died. As long as we remember them, they did not die for nothing. My name is Alex Deva, and you're listening to the Soviet Space Saga. In October 1960, the Soviet Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev held one of his flamboyant appearances in front of the United Nations, where he was heard boasting that his country was turning out missiles like, quote, sausages from a machine. To back him up, the communist apparatus of the Soviet leadership began to pressure their rocket scientists to come up with something impressive, and to do it before the beginning of the following month, when the Soviet Union would celebrate the Bolshevik Revolution. This, evidently, put an enormous amount of stress on the designers and the builders. The decision was taken to launch an R-16 rocket, which was a prototype at the time. It was a huge monster of a rocket, more than 30 meters in length and 3 meters wide. Fueled up and ready to go, it weighed 141 tons. Because the schedule had been so tight, pre-launch tests had begun to overlap with the actual launch. Some cable connections had been left in their test configuration, and as a result, when the launch command was given, the actual ignition didn't happen, because you don't want the engines to really fire in a pre-launch test. When the ignition didn't happen, a number of checks were performed all at the same time, one of which included resetting the clock on the second stage to T-0, which, predictably, caused it to ignite. By doing that, it set the underneath first stage on fire, detonating the fuel tanks in a colossal explosion. According to declassified documents decades later, over 100 people died. Some tried to run away, were stopped by a fence, and died there. The ones who were closer were instantly evaporated. The ones who were farther either suffocated or burned. Among the victims was Marshal Mitrofan Ivanovich Nedelin, the head of the R-16 development program. He was 58 years old, a decorated hero of the Soviet Union who had survived 4 different wars. Ever since, the event is called by his name, the Nedelin disaster. 2 people who were well within range of the blast didn't die, and they were the designer of the missile, Mikhail Yangel, and the commanding officer of the test range. The reason they survived was that they had just gone for a smoke behind a solid building nearby. Before you hurry and say that smoking saved his life, well, Yangel died a few years later after his heart attack number 5. News of the catastrophe was immediately silenced. It was announced officially that Nedelin had died in a plane crash, and that, in fact, all of the missing people were plane crash victims. It must have seemed like all the nearby planes had fallen in the same day carrying rocket engineers. One indirect consequence of the disaster was a delay in the program, which gave Khrushchev the idea to install missiles in Cuba in order to make up for it. The rest is history and can be found in history books under the title The Cuban Missile Crisis. The first cosmonaut to die in the line of duty was Valentin Bondarenko. He was one of the group of 20 Soviet cosmonauts that had begun training in early 1961. He was 24 years old, which made him the youngest of them all. He was Ukrainian. He loved to sing and to play football. He even had a nickname, Zvonochek, meaning Tinkerbell. Part of the cosmonaut training program included something called the isolation chamber. Its purpose was to simulate conditions in space, like the sort of rarefied atmosphere that they would breathe in the Vostok space capsule. Rather than setting up a hospital on a tall mountain, they built an hermetically sealed room right in Moscow, at the Institute of Aviation and Space Medicine. The cosmonaut being tested would have to enter the room and live there for a few weeks. He was given water, food, and a hot plate on which to cook it. In order to measure the effect that the isolation had on the subject, he was given all kinds of mental puzzles. Most of the time he would be doing nothing at all, perhaps sleeping, but random and sudden alarms would wake him up so the doctors could evaluate his responses. On his 10th day in isolation, Bondarenko went through a routine which involved taking off his medical sensors in order to clean them up. To do that, he used a cotton swab soaked in alcohol. He swiped the sensor and his skin, then tossed the cotton pad without looking. It landed on the hot plate, which was switched on. Because the atmosphere in the isolation chamber had been designed to mirror the air he would breathe in a spacecraft, it contained almost twice as much oxygen as normal. Oxygen burns incredibly fast, and when the cotton pad caught fire, so did everything else. Bondarenko fought to put it out, but it wouldn't have been possible. The isolation room had a double door in order to keep it sealed, and the crew outside rushed to open it. But they couldn't because the air pressure was holding it shut. It took several long minutes before they could enter the room, and incredibly, they found Bondarenko still alive. He died, though, 16 hours later in hospital. Of course, the party leadership tried to hide Bondarenko's death. They airbrushed his face out of group photographs and tried to remove mentions of his name from official documents. This lack of transparency was certainly hurtful in many ways, but one specific consequence is worth talking about. Had the Soviets not tried to hide Bondarenko's death, and the circumstances in which it occurred, then the international scientific community would have been made aware of the dangers of fire in oxygen-rich environments. Perhaps people would have studied this phenomenon closer. Some of these studies would have certainly found their way to the United States, and somebody at NASA would have noted that the decision to fill the Apollo 1 capsule with pure oxygen was too risky. But because the Soviets kept it a secret, no lesson was learned from this tragedy, and the American tragedy of the Apollo 1 crew happened under almost identical circumstances. 3 astronauts died like cosmonaut Bondarenko. One of the biggest setbacks in the Soviet space program was the death of the man at its center, Sergei Korolev. He died on January 14th, 1966, and with that, his existence could finally be acknowledged publicly. He was given a big state funeral, and his ashes were interred in the Kremlin wall, which was a great honor in the Soviet Union. His successor was Vasily Mishin, whom I've briefly mentioned in the episode about the moon. Having worked with Korolev since they went to Germany together after the war, Mishin was not a young man anymore by the time he was expected to replace his friend. Mishin was a good and talented engineer, but not as good with people and certainly not as favored by the communist politicians. He also didn't have Korolev's impressive capacity to work almost non-stop. Right before the fall of the Soviet Union, Vasily Mishin wrote a book, and the title of the book was a question: why didn't we fly to the moon? It had to be an apologetic book, since in Mishin's time, the Soviet space program fell quite short of the amount and quality of accomplishments that it had seen with Korolev at the helm. In his book, Mishin outlines the gigantic initiatives that were transferred to his shoulders in 1966 on top of his existing job. One of the initiatives was the Soyuz program, which involved the transfer of cosmonauts from one ship to another in space. The second was the development of a manned mission around the moon, with 2 cosmonauts who would loop around it and come back. The third was putting a cosmonaut on the moon and returning him home. The sheer magnitude of these tasks made them something that Mishin was not equal to. It certainly didn't help that, by that time, NASA was doing all those things before them. On the bright side, the unmanned missions were going well, both to the moon and to Venus and Mars. But the new main goal of the space race, the manned moon mission, wasn't getting any closer to Vasily Mishin. His best hope lay with the new N-1 rocket, whose development had started in Korolev's time and which Mishin was now trying to promote to the Soviet leadership. But time was running short, really short. Things needed to go perfectly every time, and they didn't always. A combination of an American setback and the Soviet success occurred that won the latter a bit of time. The American setback was the Apollo 1 disaster, and the Soviet success was the testing of the capsule that was supposed to carry cosmonauts to the moon. But the optimism was soon shattered when another catastrophe struck. Sayus I was the first manned mission of the first-generation spacecraft that was meant to fly people to the moon. It took place on April 23, 1967. By that time, it had been more than 2 years since the Soviets had sent a man or a woman to space. Certainly no cosmonaut had flown since the death of Sergei Korolev. The man that was chosen to fly again was Vladimir Mikhailovich Komarov. 3 years earlier, Komarov had flown on the first spaceflight in history to carry more than one person. And this new flight would make him the first cosmonaut ever to fly twice. Sadly, he was also about to become the first human to die in a spaceflight. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union was, at that time, quite concerned with the anniversary of Lenin's birthday. It wasn't even a round number. There had been 97 years since his birth. But the anniversary fell on April 22nd, and something impressive had to be delivered by then. The recovery of manned spaceflights was just the thing. In addition to the anniversary, the Soviets wanted to take advantage of the brief respite in the space race that was caused by the Apollo 1 disaster in the United States. So the mission was approved, despite the fact that the spacecraft was nowhere near tested enough. According to some historians, there were 203 faults with the spacecraft that needed to be addressed before a manned mission should even have been considered. The most recent unmanned tests had failed, and Sayus I was nothing but An incredible gamble. One of the people who was all too aware of the dangers was Yuri Gagarin, who was Komarov's backup on Sayus I. Some people say that Gagarin fought to delay the mission, or at least to get Komarov out of it. But Komarov insisted despite having serious misgivings about it. When the time came to board, Komarov was a resigned man. His fellow cosmonauts tried to cheer him up by singing, and eventually he joined in. It was very early in the morning, only a few weeks after his 40th birthday. The sun wasn't even up when, on top of an R-7 rocket, Sayus I launched to meet it. This is Vladimir Komarov's voice, hailing the Communist Party of the Soviet Union.
Народом нашей Родины, прокладывающий человечеству путь к коммунизму, летчик-космонавт Комаров.
Things went well for all of 8 minutes. But once in orbit, one of the solar panels failed to deploy, which meant that the spacecraft didn't have all the power it needed. Changing orbits failed. Attitude control failed, both automatic and manual. The climate control system failed. Then communications started to fail as well. The initial purpose of the mission had been to perform a rendezvous with Sayus II, but that second flight had to be cancelled because of thunderstorms. So, after spending just over 1 day in orbit, Komarov abandoned the mission and began the procedures to return to Earth. And more things failed. Because of the unplanned re-entry, the ship had to be braked using manual controls by Komarov. Despite all the conditions, he managed that admirably. But the worst was still to come. The capsule re-entered the atmosphere, and its main parachute failed to deploy. In the words of cosmonaut Georgy Grechko, the ship was doomed, because the parachute had been packed too tightly, and with the flight being postponed, it had bunched up and got stuck. The capsule containing Komarov burned and crashed into Earth at high speed. It is said that Gagarin himself retrieved his friend's remains from the wreckage. The two had been very close. Gagarin was the face of the Soviet space program. He was more than a hero of the nation, he was a hero of the planet. More importantly to the Communist Party, he was a fantastic asset. His life, as such, was hardly his anymore. He was grounded from space flights because the Soviet Union could not afford to risk his life. After years and years of insistence, he had managed to convince Korolev to let him fly again on a Soyuz mission. But when Vladimir Komarov died in Soyuz I, Gagarin was removed from the cosmonaut corps altogether. The risk was just too great. Desperate to fly again, Gagarin returned to fighter jets. He was assigned to a training unit with experienced instructors. And on one such training flight, on the morning of March 27, 1968, for reasons that people have been speculating about ever since, Gagarin died in a plane crash, together with his instructor Vladimir Seryagin. He was 34 years old. In the thick snow where the wreckage was discovered, next to his body, the search team found his wallet. In it, he had his driving license and a photograph of Sergei Korolev. Time passed, and the Soyuz program was restarted. In 1968, Sayus III became the first successful crewed mission of the program, and the safety record of Soyuz improved from that point onwards. In fact, even today, Soyuz is statistically the safest and cheapest human spaceflight vehicle, and a Soyuz vehicle is permanently docked to the International Space Station to be used as emergency escape craft. But before the ISS was even dreamed, the Soviets had built the first space station in the world, and launched it in 1971. Its name was Solioth I, and it was unmanned for the first months of its life. The mission Sayus I should have been the one in which cosmonauts would finally enter it for the first time. But to the extreme annoyance of the 3 cosmonauts on board, their Soyuz spacecraft was unable to fully dock with the space station. They returned to Earth and had to try again. The next attempt was made with Sayus I. The mission was assigned to Alexei Leonov, Valery Kubasov, and Pyotr Kolodin. But in a routine examination only a few days before launch, Kubasov, who was the flight engineer, became suspected of tuberculosis. To avoid any risks, the mission was given to the backup crew. The backup crew then consisted of Georgy Dobrovolsky as commander, Vladislav Volkov as the flight engineer, and Viktor Patsayev as research engineer. Of them, only Volkov had flown before, once, on another Soyuz mission. They launched, found the space station, successfully docked to it, and became the first humans ever to board a space station. In another world record, they lived on board Solioth for 22 whole days. It was a huge success. Their stay was televised back to Earth and enjoyed great publicity. On June 29, 1971, the cosmonauts moved back into the Soyuz capsule and undocked from Solioth. The automated systems took over. The capsule braked for re-entry and everything seemed to be going well, until communication was inexplicably interrupted. After entering the atmosphere, the capsule was supposed to separate from the descent module, in an operation similar to the one that had given Gagarin and Titov so much trouble. 2 explosive bolts were supposed to ensure the separation. By mistake or accident, rather than exploding in sequence, they went out at the same time. The force of the combined shocks damaged the seal of a valve, and the air leaked out of the capsule in a few seconds. This was at 168 kilometers above ground, far too high for the valve to have been opened. The cosmonauts asphyxiated, despite Patsayev probably trying to manually close the valve. It all happened too quickly. The capsule landed itself automatically without further incident, but the people inside were dead. Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev became the first people to die in space. As of today, they are still the only people to have died in space. Another negative first occurred in April 1975, and it was the first launch abort with a crew. The mission was Sayus 18A. The A at the end follows from the fact that the Soviets only named successful missions, and so the number 18 was reassigned to the next one. But what happened on this mission was that after nearly 5 minutes from the launch, the rocket deviated significantly from its assigned trajectory to the point where the onboard systems decided that it was too dangerous for the humans on board. The auto-abort system functioned as it was designed, but because the rocket was already flying downwards at the time, the capsule was thrown away at a much higher acceleration than expected. For a few moments, the cosmonauts went through over 20 G. That means that each cosmonaut weighed about a ton. When they finally landed, it was in chest-deep snow in the middle of nowhere, and the capsule began rolling downhill. At the base of the hill there was a gigantic gorge, but luckily the parachute got tangled in the trees and stopped the fall. The 2 cosmonauts got out in the freezing cold, started a fire, and began burning documents because they believed that they had landed in China. In 1975, the relationship between China and the Soviet Union was certainly not friendly, and the cosmonauts feared that, having survived the launch abort and the extreme cold, they would end up in a Chinese prison. Fortunately for them, they were still on Soviet territory and were able to be rescued. There were other setbacks in the Soviet space program. One of the most notable ones was the explosion of a rocket on the launch pad in March 1980. Because it happened more than 2 hours before the scheduled launch, there were over 100 people moving around the launch pad. In what the accident investigators called an explosion caused by human error, 48 people died in the fire that followed. The disaster is remembered not only for the victims, but also for the bravery of the rescuers who kept going back for bodies long before the fire was put out. All of these tragedies are important. Learning from mistakes is important. Talking about mistakes is important. If the Soviets hadn't kept secret the circumstances of Bondarenko's death, perhaps the Apollo 1 disaster would have been avoided. If the faulty parachute system in Sayus I hadn't been investigated, it was discovered that Sayus II would have suffered exactly the same fate. If. Setbacks happened and they had consequences. But on the whole, including its setbacks, the Soviet program was fantastically successful. In the previous episodes, we've talked about a number of major firsts. In fact, the list of firsts accomplished by the Soviets is far too large to dedicate one episode to each of them. Listen to the next episode to discover what else the Soviets did for the first time in the history of space exploration. This has been an episode of The Soviet Space Saga, a podcast written and produced by me, Alex Deva. If you like the way I tell stories, look up my books on Amazon. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, just send me a message. My website is alxx.se, and you'll find a link to it in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening.